Hi, it's been a while. So, I just graduated from UC Berkeley, woohoo, a month ago. And honestly, I thought that when I graduated, I would have all this free time and I would be pumping out videos week after week after week, and that obviously did not happen. I'll probably talk about why that did not happen at the end of this video, because I want to use this video as a space for me to share why I love UC Berkeley so much and why I appreciate it so much as an institution, but also to grapple with some of the ways it as a school and public education as a whole can fail students, particularly low-income and underrepresented minority students. So strap in. I have a feeling it's going to be a long one. Before we get into some of the cons or more challenging things about UC Berkeley, I do want to quickly share, those same statistics that you probably hear on every campus tour, but still something that is noteworthy. 26% of our student body are first-generation students. What does that mean? That means 26, more than a quarter of students at UC Berkeley don't have any family members who went through college and they're the first of their family. That is incredible. That's incredible that they're going to be able to provide that example for the rest of their family at one of the leading institutions in the world. Very few other universities can boast that same statistic and also offer the same quality of education that Berkeley does and the same level of resources. So I think that's really, really commendable. Similarly, a third of our students receive the federal Pell Grant, which is shorthand for saying a third of our students are in dire need of financial aid and are low income. The campus diversity could use some work, and believe me, we will get there, we'll talk about it. But there are more than 5,000 students at UC Berkeley currently who identify as Chicano, Hispanic, or Latino, and that's more than some private schools' entire student populations. And also, one of the main reasons I went to Berkeley, the in-state tuition for UC Berkeley is quite literally a quarter of the cost that you would find for private institutions. And arguably, you're getting the same, if not a better education. And saving the best for last, UC Berkeley is the home of the campus meme page, so you are welcome for that. But of course, as I've alluded to many times in this video, UC Berkeley at times is not exactly an easy school to attend. UC Berkeley is a public institution. They try to offer the Berkeley experience to as many students as they can, and they admit a lot of students. Some might say they over-admit students. And because of that, campus housing is number one, unaffordable, and number two, unavailable, to the point that most of us are forced to find off-campus housing after our freshman year, and some of us are forced to find off-campus housing during their freshman year. At the same time, if you take a step back, you take off your student hat and you just look at UC Berkeley as an institution and you realize its place in the world, some of these problems, at least for me, start to make more sense. I've hinted at this, I might have said it already, but UC Berkeley's mission is to offer a world-class education at a fraction of the cost that other people are charging for it to as many people as it possibly can. That means more than 30,000 students as it currently stands for UC Berkeley, all the while keeping tuition at reasonable rates, at least compared to our private peers, right? That mission statement is very difficult to achieve. And when you put yourself in that mindset, it's easy to see how the individual Berkeley student may receive less support in order to keep that mission alive and offer the Berkeley experience to as many people as possible, right? Put simply, the university has bigger fish to fry than to keep monitoring whether or not you are on track to fulfill your breath requirements or to even ensure that you have a bed to sleep in. It really just puts you into the real world and says, fly, bitch, Now, my Berkeley bias is showing, and I assume it's been showing throughout this entire video, but I think we can all agree that private schools depend on churning out billionaires from its class so they can funnel that money back into the school via donation. That is a fundamentally different financial model than the one Berkeley is trying to do, right? That donation cycle at private institutions are why the costs and tuitions are so prohibitively high, and that wealthy people have an easier time getting into and adjusting to the environment of these private elite schools. Berkeley, on the other hand, is not concerned with churning out ultra-wealthy millionaires and billionaires, although it certainly has from time to time. Berkeley and the University of California system as a whole is more interested in leveling out the playing field. The New York Times did an analysis on colleges and class mobility, and you know what one of the schools to come out on top was? Berkeley. And UCLA, another UC school. So what does that mean? According to the New York Times standards, a poor person entering UC Berkeley has a 55% chance of becoming rich upon graduation from UC Berkeley. After these 4 years at Berkeley, I fully believe that education and public education is the best tool we have for class mobility, for moving up the ranks if we start from the bottom or closer to the bottom, right? And that mission is something that I will always be proud of. Now, we can argue as to what extent Berkeley succeeds at that mission, and I will get there. I do have data that we can interrogate there, but you cannot deny that that mission is baked into Berkeley's ethos and it's a part of its messaging, and that is something that's really bold and not something you would see at, I don't know, Stanford or any of these other private schools, right? Now, I can believe 100% that public education is the best engine we have to move up in class and income, and also say that Berkeley is not living up to that mission in a few key areas. So here's some historical background, as I so often like to give on this channel. In 1960, California passed the Master Plan for Higher Education. This plan envisioned a public University of California system that had no tuition, and it guaranteed access to the top 25% of all high school students from California. These ideal UC schools would be funded completely by taxpayers and would exist for taxpayers, i.e. would be funded by people living in California and would be attended by people living in California. And the idea driving this plan was that the UC system would become the engine of social mobility for Californians. And I guess that dream is still alive, but what do we have today? The state of California is continuing to withdraw funds from the university, and it's forcing Berkeley and other public schools to seek funds from private and corporate sectors. We have rising tuition costs alongside rising costs of living. We have increasingly more out-of-state students to subsidize the in-state students that can't necessarily pay for this tuition. And of course, that pesky diversity problem. So let's dive into each of these issues. First, the budget. Now, the university has always been independent from the government. Even though we receive funds from the government, the legislature can't tell us what to teach or how to behave, although they probably would have loved to do that during the free speech protests. But regardless, the government doesn't have any meaningful role in any UC Berkeley operations. And that's a good thing, especially considering Berkeley's outsized presence and role in activism. But UC Berkeley has always been extremely reliant on the state for funding. That government funding with each year is becoming more and more scarce, especially in the last year because of COVID. So let me show you some data. The sum amount of money that the state of California allocates to the University of California system has gone up and down for the past 20 years, but the percent of the UC budget that amount represents has precipitously dropped, and I mean precipitously. Let's look at the data. At the start of the century, in 2000, the state of California had given about $3.3 million to the UC system as a whole. In 2019, they gave about $3.9 million. Seems like an increase, but again, we have to take into account inflation and the rising costs of literally everything. So in 2000, that $3.3 million represented 36.2% of the University of California's budget as a whole. But in 2019, that $3.9 million only represented 11.73%. So if we're looking at percent of the budget as a whole, that's literally a third of what it was 20 years prior. It's not just the UC system, the California State University system, or CSU, and also community colleges in California have been facing budget cut after budget cut after budget cut, and its impact is certainly felt. Librarians, adjunct professors, researchers, temp workers, and staff in general have faced stagnating and yes, even declining wages. And I'm not excusing or condoning the university for not compensating these workers properly, because I mean, there are definitely areas of the university that receive more funds than they probably should be, at least in comparison to their impact on the student body. But administrators, when asked about these paltry salaries that they're giving their worker, always say that they just cannot afford to pay them more. And I'm inclined to believe that after looking at data of state-provided funds to these schools. And what's crazy is in comparison to other states in this country, California is doing better in terms of investing in education. And California is doing a really shit job. So mark my words, this government will be remembered as the generation of politicians that believes that young people travel and education are just not worthwhile investments anymore. Messed. So in the face of declining state funds, what revenue source do universities turn to now? Well, of course, their own students' pockets. The cost of UC Berkeley and every other university has risen dramatically over the past 20 years, as has the average debt of its graduates. So again, let's look at a chart. In the 2003 through 4 academic year, tuition for in-state students was only $5,858 for the entire year. In the 2018 through 19 school year, tuition was $14,184, again for in-state students. That means that tuition tripled in less than 20 years. It's absolutely ridiculous. In the same time frame, the average debt of students rose from $13,277 to $19,773. And you might be sitting there asking, well, why hasn't the average debt risen at the same rate that the tuition has? And that's largely because the university has begun to admit more out-of-state students and more international students who pay much higher tuition fees to sort of subsidize the in-state students that pay less. And there's a lot of conflicting narratives around tuition and that decision to start admitting more out-of-state students so they can still admit and provide education for lower income students in California. There's also a lot of competing narratives around who this high tuition affects the most. I think a lot of us are inclined to believe that low income students are the hardest hit because the cost is so astronomically high that they just might not even consider higher education as feasible for themselves. Even if there are grants and scholarships available to them, they just might not have the college counselors and they just might not know that the resources like grants and scholarships exist to help them. And then others say that the funds provided by the Cal Grant and other programs like it have risen to match tuition, which is true. And that's great for low-income students. But middle-income students do not qualify and have, in many ways, the worst of both worlds because they don't qualify for a lot of need-based scholarships and they'll also have to saddle a lot of debt and work 1, 2, or 5 jobs to keep up with the tuition, right? Now, this question of like who is affected most is not easily answered by the data that's available. And it's also not a question I'm particularly interested in answering because at the end of the day, this high tuition hurts everyone. It's important to acknowledge that your experience isn't always reflective of everyone else's, and it's always important to acknowledge your privilege if you don't have to saddle any student debt, if you feel comfortable going through college paying the full rate. But let's not divide ourselves against something that should be a unifying force, like the fact that tuition hikes are indeed bad and students of every income level should be fighting them. Now, remember what I said earlier about the university system admitting more international and out-of-state students to subsidize lower income Californian students? That is very, very real, and the data confirms it. Californians used to make up more than 90% of the student population in the 80s, and we're now at a solid 75%. And you can see exactly when this happened in the graph. It was 2009 through 2010, which was the very same year that UC tuition famously rose beyond $10,000 for the first time in history. But if you'll remember, the Master Plan of Higher Education stated that the original goal for the UC system was to be by and for Californians. And I'm of two minds on this issue. A lot of my friends I've made throughout UC Berkeley are from outside of California and are from outside of the States. I think it's good to diversify a student body, and geography is a way in which you can achieve that. And generally, I'm not a fan of policies that rely on rigid, definitive borders. But even if it's increasing the ethnic or the thought diversity of the campus, it is certainly not doing anything to improve the income diversity of the student body, because everyone that comes from outside of California does not qualify for these same federal need-based scholarships that people in-state do. So they're almost always from these upper income brackets that can afford to pay the full out-of-state tuition. But now let's talk about ethnic diversity. I've said it before, UC Berkeley is by and for Californians. So under that logic, you would expect that the student demographics of Berkeley would resemble the state of California's demographics, right? No. So in this graph, the blue bar represents the percentage for UC Berkeley and yellow is the state of California. And almost 40% of the student body at UC Berkeley is Asian. And that's a pretty clear departure from the state demographics where Asians only only make up about 15% of the population. And you know, as an Asian student myself, I can't disregard the fact that this demographic meant that I was really easily able to find a community in Berkeley and people who I could like immediately connect with based off of shared experiences and shared culture. But the same cannot be said for like any other underrepresented minority on campus. And then of course you got white people. Hey, you guys are kind of a minority on Berkeley's campus. Not really, like you're still the second most populous group at about 21% of the population, but that is very unusual for white people to not be the majority or even the plurality of students at a highly ranked college like Berkeley. But here's where the problem lies. Berkeley only has about 1,000 Black and African American students on campus, which is only about 3.7% of our population. Black people make up about 5.5% of California's population as a whole, so there's a clear disparity there. And like, let's be honest, 1,000 students, my high school was bigger than that. That is just abysmal numbers. That's terrible. And the biggest disparity by far is with Hispanic and Latinx and Chicano students. They make about 18% of our student population, but almost 40% of California as a state. And why are these numbers so bad for Black students, for Hispanic students, for Native students, etc.? It's because of Proposition 209, which banned the use of affirmative action for UC Berkeley and any other public institutions in California, essentially meaning that our admissions officers are not allowed to take race into consideration in any way, shape, or form during the admissions process. And the topic of affirmative action has a long and complicated history, especially in California in regards to education. And I'm not going to tackle it here, maybe in a future video if there's enough interest. But what I will say is that this is a problem unique to public colleges. Private schools can and do consider race and ethnicity in their admissions processes. And they can do that because they're private. They're not bound by state laws like the UC system is, and that honestly sucks. The last thing I want to talk about is donations. The first time Berkeley ever actively campaigned for donations from its alumni was in 1985. That's crazy. That's crazy. Like I said earlier, schools like Stanford rely on billionaire philanthropists to fund new buildings, new research labs, new departments, etc. That has just never been in our ethos as an institution because, well, this school puts us through the ringer and a lot of us just do not want to give back after graduating. But also, Berkeley is first and foremost trying to elevate lower and middle class students into the upper middle and upper classes instead of upper class students into the 1%. At least that's the idea, because in recent years, Berkeley has been turning to more private donors, more corporate donors, and yes, more wealthy alumni donors. Side note, I really love like looking at research grants and like who funds research. So if you would like a video on that, let me know, because I have so much data and like so much background knowledge on that. That would be really useful for a video. Anyways, am I saying that Berkeley shouldn't be considered a public school anymore? No, go back and watch the first part of this video. I'm so proud of this school, the community that has produced, the countless students that have walked through this campus and have gone on to accomplish amazing things while staying true to the Berkeley spirit. I'm just saying that in comparison to what Berkeley and the University of California initially set out to do, we look pretty bad. But in comparison to other states, and specifically private institutions in particular, we look pretty damn good. And that is something to be celebrated, and it is worth preserving. Now, I apologize that this video is very Berkeley centric. I thought about looking at data for colleges across the US, but after 4 years here, I just really intimately understand the issues that Berkeley students face as well as the issues that administrators face here, and I just can't possibly replicate that for any other school without attending another school. So if you do go to another school, I'm really curious to hear how much of this video ranked true for you and whether or not some of my comments missed you or hit you. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe, maybe as I enter this new stage of life of alumni-ship. I did want to film this on the UC Berkeley campus as one final goodbye, but obviously that didn't come to pass. You guys will just have to settle for this beautiful Campanile poster I have hung up for you guys. But yeah, let's talk about that. Why wasn't I able to film this on campus? That is because post-graduation depression is very real. Oh man, I thought I was gonna be so productive and be able to churn out video after video after video. But especially during COVID, finishing college in such an anticlimactic way, looking at your laptop, having to leave all of your friends in this community you've set up, and also going to a loving home, by the way. I love my parents love me, but also it can be very mentally challenging to return home to your childhood home at times because you sometimes feel like a a fish out of water, and that's how I'm feeling, except not just here, like everywhere. I'm like, what does it mean? Like, what do I mean now that I'm no longer a Berkeley student? You know, who am I? I'm having a little bit of an identity crisis, but you know, I've taken a lot of time to reflect and watch children's cartoons, and I think I'm okay now. So you can expect hopefully more frequent uploads and some content that I'm really excited about. So yeah, like, subscribe, I did that. Oh, hit the bell if you would like to be notified of when I upload videos, because I do so kind of irregularly, so you can never really be sure, so you might as well just hit the bell, you know, to be extra sure. You can follow me on Twitter. Have not been as active there as I would have liked to be, but I'm working on that. That will be a new goal of mine, as I have like 50 new goals. But yeah, I'm gonna try and be more active there, and hopefully this is my big return to the internet. I missed you all, and I'm happy to be back. So with that, I will catch you all in the next one, which will hopefully be soon. I don't know. Okay, bye.